I lived in Union, Maine for the first 14 years of my life. A beautiful blue farmhouse with a huge basement, backyard, and blueberry field. I had been hearing some strange sounds coming from my basement, and my mom never wanted me to go down there. I let my mind get the best of me, and I decided to go down one day. My mom wasn't home, and I was there with my dog, so little me took my dog down with me so I wasn't scared. I walked down the 13 stairs to the basement and my feet hit the floor, my dog right on my tail. When you walk down the stairs, you can go left or right. If you turn left, there's a little room that was used as a bedroom for my older brother. If you turned right, that was the garage area where we would bring cars in to work on them, along with the wood stove and the boiler room. Stacked along the wall was nothing but wood we used for heat. I remember walking around the area barefoot, and I stepped on a nail. I screamed in pain and wobbled my way up the stairs and tried to pull it out when my mom came home and found me in a pool of blood. We bandaged up my foot, and I was sent outside to play while my mom spent the afternoon sweeping up the basement. A few days later, I wanted to go down again, so I did. Once again brought my dog with me. This time, I made sure to wear shoes. I made it over to the boiler room when I heard a small moan. That's when my dog started to freak out. He was growling, the hair standing up on the back of his neck. He was as nervous as I was. I panicked and once again ran back upstairs. I spent days wanting to figure out what was down there, but gave up for a while. One night, I was lying in bed. You know when you're almost asleep and you get jumped awake? Well, I jumped, and when I did, I kicked my dog in the process and fell onto the ground, unable to move. The only thing I could move was my eyes, and they darted across the room at a corner I was always scared of. There, stood in that corner, was a tall black shadow. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. I started to sweat as it walked over to me and stopped right at my bedside. I looked at the clock and it said 2:07 a.m. This is when my body awoke. I looked at my clock and it said 7:02 a.m. I was asleep the whole time. I told my mom about it, but of course no one believed me. I wanted so bad to know what this thing was. A few weeks later, I had just come home from school and my mom wasn't home. So I didn't do my homework 'cause as kids do. I wanted to play. My neighbor was home, so I decided to have him come outside to play with me in my basement. This is when things took a dark turn. He brought an Ouija board. We played around at the table downstairs when a pin spun around and hit me in the gut. He laughed and thought I did it on purpose when we both let go of the board. That's when the lights stayed to flicker and the board flipped up on its side. He threw it into the wood stove, but it wouldn't catch fire. That's when we knew we needed to get out of there. We started to run up the stairs when I was pushed down them. He didn't stop until he was at the top when he finally noticed. Things finally started to calm down and went back to normal. My dreams kept repeating themselves, and I eventually sought out therapy. One night, months after therapy sessions began, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that it was all in my head. The shadow, the board, the push. My therapist said it was trauma manifesting in my subconscious. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. As I closed my eyes, the familiar feeling of slipping into sleep crept in. But this time, I didn't jump awake. Instead, A whisper cut through the silence. It wasn't a voice I recognized. It was hollow, distant, like wind through a crack in an old door. "Come back." My heart pounded in my chest. I shot up in bed, breathing heavily, and instinctively glanced at the corner. It was empty, but something felt off. The air was thicker, heavier. I reached for my phone. The clock read 2:07 a.m. "No," I muttered to myself. "Not again." I forced myself to focus, gripping my sheets tightly as I tried to shake off the growing dread in my stomach. Then, just as I was about to lie back down, a soft knock echoed through my room. Not from the door, but from the window. Slowly, I turned to face it. There, behind the glass, was my reflection, but it didn't move with me. It stared, wide-eyed and expressionless, and then slowly, it smiled. I stumbled back, heart racing, unable to look away. The reflection raised a hand, and with one long, bony finger, pointed toward my closet. Trembling, I turned my head toward the closet door. It was ajar, just enough to see inside. Darkness seeped through the opening, deeper than it should have been in the dim glow of my bedside lamp. I wanted to run, scream, do anything but stay frozen in place. But just as I mustered the courage to move, the closet door creaked open, inch by inch. Then, from the darkness inside, I heard it again. "Come back." I bolted from the room, tearing down the hall and slamming into my mom's door. She groggily opened it, frustration in her eyes, but when she saw my face, her expression changed. "Honey, what happened?" I couldn't speak. My body shook violently, and tears streamed down my face. I managed to choke out, "It's back." That was the moment she believed me. The moment she finally saw the fear in my eyes and knew this wasn't just my imagination. She sat me down, wrapped me in a blanket, and for the first time, whispered something I never expected to hear. "You're not the first." I blinked at her, confused and horrified. "What do you mean?" She sighed, looking away as if debating whether to continue. Then, with a shaky voice, she said, "I saw it too when I was your age." My blood ran cold. Something told me this nightmare was far from over. My mom's words echoed in my head, a chilling confirmation that whatever haunted me had been lurking in our family for generations. You saw it too?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. She nodded slowly, eyes distant, as if reliving something she'd buried deep inside. "When I was your age, I had dreams, just like you. The dark corner, the figure, and always at 2:07 a.m. She swallowed hard. "I told my parents, but they never believed me. So, I stopped talking about it, but it never really went away." I sat in stunned silence, my heart pounding. "Mom, why didn't you tell me sooner?" She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I thought it was over. I thought if I ignored it, it would leave you alone. But I was wrong." A sudden thud from upstairs sent shivers down my spine. We both froze, staring at the ceiling. "It's still here," I muttered. Without another word, my mom grabbed my hand and led me to the living room. She rummaged through an old box on the shelf, pulling out a dusty, leather-bound book. She placed it in front of me, flipping through pages filled with faded handwriting and eerie sketches. "It's been in our family for a long time," she explained, pointing to a page showing a shadowy figure standing in the same corner of my room. My stomach dropped. "We call it the Watcher." The words beneath the drawing sent chills through me. The Watcher comes at 2:07 a.m. It waits, it watches, it lingers. Never acknowledge it, never speak of it. It thrives on fear. My mom traced a shaky finger along the text. "The more you fear it, the stronger it gets." I swallowed hard. "So what do we do? How do we stop it?" She hesitated, flipping to the next page. "There's a ritual," she said softly, "but it's risky." The instructions were written in archaic, barely legible handwriting. It required candles, salt, and something that belonged to the person being haunted, me. A sudden knock at the front door made us both jump. We exchanged wary glances. It was late, too late for visitors. Mom stood, her face pale. "Stay here," she whispered, creeping toward the door. I clutched the book tightly, my eyes darting to the clock. 2:06 a.m. "No," I gasped, scrambling to my feet. "Mom, don't open it." But it was too late. The door creaked open, and the hallway beyond was pitch black. And then a voice, deep and rasping, drifted in. "Come back." I ran to her, grabbing her arm, but she stood frozen, staring into the darkness beyond the door. And then a shadow stepped inside. The figure loomed in the doorway, a towering presence darker than the night outside. Its shape was shifting, undefined, yet undeniably real. The air around us thickened, pressing in from all sides. My mom stood frozen, eyes wide with terror, her grip tightening on the door handle. "Mom," I pleaded, tugging at her arm. "Close the door." She blinked, as if snapping out of a trance, and with a sudden burst of strength, slammed the door shut. The house shuddered from the impact, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, a whisper drifted from the other side. "I'm already inside." My breath caught in my throat. I turned, my heart hammering in my chest, and saw it, standing in the hallway behind us. The Watcher. It was closer now, no longer confined to the corner of my room. Its face, or what should have been a face, was featureless, an abyss of black void. And yet, I felt its eyes on me, watching. I stumbled back, dragging my mom with me. "The book," she gasped, eyes darting to the leather-bound tome on the coffee table. "We need to follow the ritual." With trembling hands, I grabbed it, flipping through the brittle pages as fast as I could. Salt, candles, a personal belonging. I could barely focus, my vision blurring with fear. "Here," I shouted, pointing to the section. "We need to make a circle of salt. It can't cross it." My mom scrambled to the kitchen, and I followed close behind. But as we reached the pantry, the lights flickered violently. The Watcher's voice filled the room, whispering just beneath the sound of the buzzing bulbs. "You can't escape me." "No," I muttered, yanking the salt container from the shelf. "Not this time." We rushed back to the living room, spilling salt onto the floor in a shaky, uneven circle. My mom grabbed the candles, lighting them with trembling hands as I stood inside the ring. The watcher hovered at the edge, its dark form rippling like smoke. The book said to recite an incantation, words in a language I didn't recognize, scrawled in jagged handwriting. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "Here goes nothing," I whispered and began to chant. The moment the words left my lips, the room trembled. The candles flickered wildly, casting elongated shadows across the walls. The watcher let out a low, guttural sound, a sound that felt like it was inside my head, twisting my thoughts, my fears, my very soul. You cannot banish what you do not understand. I squeezed my eyes shut, repeating the chant over and over, louder each time. The shadows convulsed, shrinking and expanding, and then, suddenly, it let out a piercing shriek. The watcher's form wavered, its presence growing weaker, fading into the darkness from where it came. And then, it was gone. I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath. My mom knelt beside me, clutching me tightly. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice hoarse. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to believe it was gone for good. But deep down, I knew the truth. It was still watching, and it would be back. The days that followed were quiet, too quiet. I should have felt relieved, but I didn't. Every creak of the floor, every whisper of wind against the windows sent a shiver down my spine. I could feel it lingering in the corners of my vision, just beyond my perception. My mom tried to act normal, cooking meals, humming old songs, but I could see it in her eyes. She was just as scared as I was. The book stayed on the coffee table, open to the ritual page, as if closing it would erase our fragile defense. Then, the nightmares started again. Each night, I woke up at exactly 2:07 a.m., drenched in sweat, my heart racing. But this time, the dreams were different. In them, I wasn't alone. The watcher stood closer now, whispering things I couldn't understand. But there was something worse. There was another figure. At first, I thought it was me, a reflection of my fear. But it wasn't. It was smaller, hunched, and it whispered with the watcher. Their voices tangled together in my dreams, a sickening harmony that left me paralyzed in my bed. One night, I woke up gasping, eyes darting to my alarm clock, 2:07 a.m. But this time, something was different. The closet door was open. I never left my closet open. Swallowing hard, I reached for my phone to turn on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on the rows of clothes. Nothing. I sighed in relief. But then, a shadow moved. I froze. It wasn't just the usual tricks of my tired eyes. Something shifted deep in the closet, and then I heard it, the soft scrape of nails against wood. I couldn't move. My hand trembled as I gripped the phone tighter. "Mom," I whispered, barely able to form the word. And then, something stepped forward. It wasn't the watcher this time. It was smaller, closer. It had eyes. Two pale, milky orbs gleamed in the light, staring right at me from the darkness of my closet. My throat tightened as I felt the air grow cold. "Come back," it whispered, and before I could scream, it lunged. I bolted out of bed, crashing into my bedroom door, fumbling with the handle as the thing scrambled behind me, its breath ragged and wet. I could feel it, its cold fingers grazing the back of my shirt. Finally, the door flew open, and I tumbled into the hallway, slamming it shut behind me. My mom appeared almost instantly, eyes wide with alarm. What happened? I couldn't speak, couldn't form the words. Instead, I pointed to my room, my chest heaving. She held me close, and for the first time, I felt like a kid again, small, helpless. "We need help," she whispered. "Real help." The next morning, we packed bags and left the house. We drove for hours until we reached a small town where my mom's old friend lived, someone she claimed had experience with things like this. Her name was Margaret, an older woman with sharp, knowing eyes and an air of quiet authority. The moment she saw me, she nodded as if she already knew what we were dealing with. "It's been following your family for generations," she said, running her fingers over the worn pages of the book. "You did the right thing with the salt, but it's only a temporary fix. This thing is tied to you." My stomach churned. Tied to me? How do I get rid of it? Margaret's expression darkened. Getting rid of it isn't the problem. The problem is why it's attached to you in the first place. She reached into a small wooden chest and pulled out an old photograph. It was faded, but I recognized the house immediately. My house. But standing in the window was a figure. Tall, dark, familiar. "This isn't the first time it's chosen someone," Margaret said grimly, "and it won't be the last." I stared at the photo, my heart pounding. "So what do we do?" Margaret glanced at my mom, then back at me. "We go back," she said, "and we finish this." The drive back to the house felt longer than I remembered, each mile weighed down by a sense of impending doom. Margaret sat in the back seat, flipping through the pages of the book with a quiet intensity, muttering things under her breath that I couldn't quite catch. My mom, gripping the steering wheel tightly, hadn't spoken since we left Margaret's place. I stared out the window, watching the familiar landscape blur past, my stomach twisting in knots. I didn't want to go back. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to turn around and run, but I knew that wouldn't work. Margaret was right. This thing was tied to me. No matter where I went, it would follow. Finally, we pulled into the driveway. The house loomed in front of us, dark and silent. It looked the same as when we left, but something about it felt off, as if it was waiting for us. "All right," Margaret said, stepping out of the car and grabbing a small leather bag. "We need to do this carefully. No fear, no hesitation. It feeds on both." My mom and I exchanged a nervous glance but nodded. We followed Margaret up the porch steps, the old wood groaning beneath our weight. The front door creaked open, and a wave of stale, cold air hit us. I swallowed hard and stepped inside. Margaret set her bag down on the living room table and began unpacking. Candles, a vial of dark liquid, a bundle of dried herbs tied with twine. She motioned for me to sit in the middle of the salt circle we'd left before. "Stay inside the circle," she warned. "No matter what you see, no matter what you hear." I nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle heavily in my chest. Margaret lit the candles, their flames flickering weakly against the oppressive darkness. She sprinkled the dark liquid in a ring around me, murmuring something under her breath. The air grew thicker, charged with an energy that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. "Close your eyes," she instructed. I obeyed, squeezing them shut, focusing on the rhythmic sound of Margaret's voice as she chanted in a language I didn't understand. The scent of burning herbs filled my nostrils, earthy and sharp. Then, the whispers started. "Come back." I flinched, but Margaret's voice rose in intensity. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, pressing in from all sides. I felt a chill crawl down my spine. I risked opening my eyes, and my heart nearly stopped. The watcher was there, standing just outside the salt circle, its featureless face inches from mine. But this time, it wasn't alone. The smaller figure was there too, hunched and trembling, its pale eyes locked onto mine. It reached out a thin, bony hand toward me, its mouth moving silently, forming words I couldn't hear. "No," Margaret shouted, tossing a handful of the herbs into the air. They ignited instantly, filling the room with a brilliant flash of light. The watcher recoiled, its form twisting unnaturally, flickering in and out of existence. The smaller figure let out a low, guttural sound and retreated into the shadows. My mom grabbed my hand tightly. "Is it working?" Margaret's face was tense, sweat beading on her forehead. "Almost, but it's fighting back." Suddenly, the lights in the house flickered violently. A deep, rattling growl echoed through the walls, and a sudden force hit me like a wave. I gasped, struggling to stay inside the circle as an invisible force tried to drag me out. "Hold on," Margaret yelled, her voice strained. "It's trying to break the barrier." I squeezed my mom's hand tighter, tears streaming down my face. I can't do this." "Yes, you can," Margaret snapped, locking eyes with me. "It's trying to make you weak. Don't let it." I gritted my teeth, forcing myself to sit still as Margaret poured the last of the dark liquid onto the floor. She raised her arms, shouting the final words of the ritual, and with one final, ear-piercing shriek, the watcher and its companion dissolved into black smoke, vanishing into the darkness. The silence that followed was deafening. I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. My mom wrapped her arms around me, rocking me gently. Margaret sat back, wiping her forehead with a shaky hand. "Is it gone?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Margaret stared at the empty space where the watcher had stood. "For now," she said gravely, "but it'll be back." I swallowed hard. "What do we do?" Margaret's eyes darkened. "We prepare. This isn't over, not by a long shot." As we sat there in the candlelight, I realized that my life would never be normal again. The watcher might be gone for now, but it was still out there, waiting, watching, and it would always be watching. In the days that followed, life felt like a fragile illusion of normalcy. My mom tried to return to her routines, cooking breakfast, making small talk, but the tension lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. I couldn't shake the feeling that the watcher was still with us, lurking in the unseen corners of the house. Margaret insisted we fortify the house further. She moved in with us temporarily, setting up protective charms in every room, marking symbols on the walls with chalk that smelled like sulfur and old books. I didn't understand most of it, but I trusted her. She seemed to know what she was doing. Every night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, counting the minutes until 2:07 a.m., daring it to come back. And then, on the third night, it did. The clock read 2:06 a.m. when I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping against my bedroom window. I turned, my breath hitching in my throat. The window blinds were shut, but the tapping continued. It was gentle at first, almost like rain, but soon it became more urgent. Tap, tap, tap. I squeezed my eyes shut, clutching the blanket tightly, willing it to stop. But then, I heard the whisper, "Let me in." My eyes snapped open, and for a split second, I saw it. A shadow pressed against the window, its face, or lack thereof, mere inches from the glass. The smaller figure stood behind it, its milky white eyes glowing faintly in the dark. I bolted upright, heart pounding, and scrambled for the salt container Margaret had left by my bedside. I poured a thick line along the windowsill, my hands shaking so hard that some of it spilled onto the floor. The tapping stopped. I backed away, my chest heaving, and grabbed my phone. 2:07 a.m. I wasn't dreaming. I burst into Margaret's room, gasping for air. She was already awake, as if she'd been expecting me. "It's back," I whispered. She nodded grimly, grabbing a small vial from her bedside table and handing it to me. "You need to stand your ground. The salt will hold it for now, but this," she gestured to the vial, "will force it to show its true form." I stared at the vial, the liquid inside swirling like ink in water. "I don't want to see its true form," I whispered. "You have to," she said firmly. "It's the only way to understand what it wants." I swallowed hard, nodding. There was no running from this. That night, with Margaret and my mom by my side, I stood by the window, holding the vial tightly in my trembling hand. The clock ticked over to 2:07 a.m., and, like clockwork, the tapping returned. Margaret gave me a reassuring nod, and I took a deep breath before flinging the vial against the glass. The liquid splattered across the window, and for a split second, nothing happened. Then, the shadow outside the window twitched violently, convulsing as if in pain. Its form rippled and distorted, and as the ink-like substance spread across it, I saw it. It wasn't human. Its skin, if it could be called that, was cracked and stretched like old leather, with jagged ridges running down its elongated limbs. Its face was an empty void, swirling with darkness, but its mouth, its real mouth, was filled with rows of needle-sharp teeth, grinning hungrily. And then there was the smaller figure behind it. It was no child. It was something worse. Its pale eyes weren't just looking at me. They were inside my head, whispering my fears back at me. "You can't hide forever." It crooned in a voice that made my skin crawl. Margaret sprang into action, chanting loudly as she threw another handful of herbs onto the floor. The shadow shrieked, a sound that rattled the walls, and for a brief moment, it pressed against the window so hard I thought the glass would shatter. Then, it vanished. I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air, my mind reeling. Margaret crouched beside me, gripping my shoulders tightly. "You saw it, didn't you?" I nodded weakly. "It's not just watching me," I choked out. "It wants me." She exchanged a worried glance with my mom. "That thing, it's an inviter. It won't stop until you willingly let it in." My stomach churned. "What happens if I do?" Margaret's face darkened. "Then you'll never leave it again." A cold shiver ran down my spine. I didn't sleep that night, and deep down, I knew the worst was still to come. The following day, Margaret took action. She barricaded every window with symbols, chanted incantations under her breath, and sprinkled powders across doorways that smelled of burnt sage and iron. I watched her in silence, my hands trembling. Sleep was a distant memory, and exhaustion clung to me like a weight I couldn't shake. "It's getting stronger," she muttered, pressing a charm into my palm. "And so are you, but we need answers." I looked up at her, my voice barely above a whisper. "Answers? Like why it wants me?" Margaret nodded. "Yes, these things don't just appear without a reason. Something invited it here long ago, and it's latched onto your family ever since. We have to find out why." My mom sat at the kitchen table, looking pale and worn. "What if we just leave?" she asked weakly. "Move far away?" Margaret gave her a sharp look. "You can't run from it. It's tied to him now." She turned to me, her gaze softening slightly. "We fight it here, or it follows him forever." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. "So, what do we do?" Margaret opened the old book, flipping through the yellowed pages until she stopped on an entry that made my stomach twist. "The inviter thrives in the places where fear is sown. It grows stronger in those who deny it, and it waits for a moment of weakness to be welcomed in." Margaret tapped the page. "It needs an opening, a moment where you're too afraid to resist it." I thought back to all the times I'd been frozen in fear. Every nightmare, every moment it had stood in my room. Had I unknowingly given it an opening already? Margaret seemed to read my mind. "Not yet," she assured me, "but it's testing you, wearing you down." A sudden chill ran through me. "Then how do we stop it?" Margaret hesitated, then closed the book with a heavy sigh. "We call it out, confront it, force it to reveal its full form. Once it manifests completely, we can sever its link." I stared at her in disbelief. "You want to invite it in?" "Not quite," she said, gathering a bundle of black candles. "We lure it out on our terms." My mom shook her head. "This is insane. You're asking him to risk. He's already at risk," Margaret interrupted. "The longer we wait, the stronger it gets." I took a shaky breath. "I'll do it," I said, surprising even myself. Margaret nodded. "Then tonight, we face it head on." That night, we sat in a circle in the middle of the living room. The air was thick with the scent of burning sage, and the house was deadly silent. The only sound was my own heartbeat thudding in my ears. Margaret handed me a silver pendant. Keep this close. If it tries to enter your mind, this will ground you." I nodded, gripping it tightly. The clock read 2:05 a.m. Margaret began the ritual, her voice strong and steady, chanting words that echoed through the room. The flames of the black candles flickered violently, and a slow, creeping coldness filled the air. 2:06 a.m. I felt it before I saw it. A shadow pooled in the corner of the room, stretching out like inky tendrils, curling and twisting unnaturally. The watcher stepped forward, its empty face inches from the edge of the circle. Then, the smaller figure emerged behind it. It spoke in a voice that was both distant and intimate, whispering inside my head, "Let me in." I clenched the pendant tightly, shaking my head. "No," I whispered, my voice trembling. The watcher's form contorted violently, its limbs jerking unnaturally. It leaned closer, pressing against an invisible barrier that Margaret's symbols had created. Margaret's chanting grew louder, the flames roaring higher. The smaller figure grinned, revealing a mouth full of jagged teeth. "Why are you afraid? You brought me here." My blood ran cold. "What are you talking about?" I stammered. It laughed softly, pointing a bony finger at me. "You asked for me in your dreams. You wanted answers." Memories flooded back. Nights spent staring into the dark corner, wondering, asking silently what was lurking there. Margaret's voice faltered slightly. "Don't listen to it," she said firmly. "It's lying." But deep down, a part of me wasn't sure. The shadows shifted, the watcher growing taller, its form solidifying. Margaret threw a handful of salt at it, and it shrieked, recoiling briefly. "It's working," she shouted. "Keep going." The smaller figure's grin widened. It stepped forward, pressing its hand against the invisible barrier, and cracks began to form. "Soon," it whispered. A sudden gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing the candles all at once. Darkness swallowed us whole. I could feel it moving, circling us in the pitch black. My mom clung to me, her breath ragged. "Margaret?" she whispered, but there was no answer. Then, the voice came again, right next to my ear. "Let me in." Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to hold firm. "No," I screamed, gripping the pendant so tightly it dug into my skin. A blinding flash erupted from Margaret's hands as she reignited the candles with a roar of energy. The watcher screamed in pain, its form flickering and distorting. The smaller figure lunged toward me, but this time, I didn't freeze. I threw salt at it with everything I had, and it recoiled with a hideous shriek, dissolving into a swirling mist. Margaret chanted faster, the words blending together in a crescendo. With one final burst of energy, the shadows retreated, fading into the corners of the room. Then, silence. I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath. My mom sobbed quietly beside me, clutching my arm. Margaret knelt beside me, exhausted but triumphant. "You did it," she whispered. "You resisted." I looked around the room, my heart still pounding. "Is it gone?" Margaret frowned, wiping sweat from her forehead. "For now, but it'll always try to come back. I swallowed hard, knowing she was right. The Watcher was gone, but not defeated, and it was only a matter of time before it found another way in. The days that followed were uneasy. The house felt empty, yet heavy, as if something lingered just beneath the surface, waiting for another chance to creep back in. Margaret assured us that the ritual had weakened the Watcher, but she never said it was truly gone. That was the worst part, knowing it could return at any moment. I couldn't sleep. Even in broad daylight, shadows stretched too far, and every creak of the house sent my pulse racing. My mom was a wreck, jumping at the slightest noise, and Margaret spent most of her time reinforcing the house with wards and protective charms. Then, one night, the dreams changed. I found myself standing in a dark, endless void, with nothing but the distant whisper of my own thoughts echoing around me. I knew I was dreaming, but it felt different. I looked down and saw that I was holding something. The pendant. It glowed faintly in my hand, pulsing like a heartbeat. Then, a voice, not the Watchers, but something else, spoke from the darkness. You cannot escape what is bound to you. I turned sharply, my breathing ragged. The Watcher wasn't there, but I could feel it lurking just beyond sight. The smaller figure was nowhere to be seen, but something told me it was still watching, waiting. I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. My clock read 2:07 a.m. I sat frozen, gripping the pendant around my neck, feeling its cold metal against my skin. This time, though, something felt off. The house was too quiet. Slowly, I slid out of bed, my feet touching the cold floor. The hallway was dark, but a faint light flickered under Margaret's door. I pushed it open, expecting to see her asleep or reading, but the room was empty, and the window was wide open. My stomach churned. "Mom," I whispered into the darkness, but there was no answer. I stepped into the hallway, my pulse quickening with every step. The air was heavy, thick with something I couldn't explain. As I reached the living room, I froze. The salt circle was broken. Panic shot through me like ice water. My mom was standing near the fireplace, staring at something in her hands. I called out to her, but she didn't respond. I moved closer. "Mom." She turned slowly, and in the dim light, I saw her face. Her eyes, they were distant, unfocused, and her lips moved in a silent whisper. She was holding a small, old photo, one I had never seen before. It was of our house, but in the picture, there was a shadow standing in the window. The Watcher. Tears streamed down her face, and she whispered. I let it in. My blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" "Mom, we stopped it." She shook her head violently, her voice breaking. "I thought I could end it. I just wanted it to stop." I felt sick. "What did you do?" Before she could answer, a sudden crash came from upstairs. Margaret's voice shouted something, followed by the unmistakable sound of glass shattering. I turned to run, but my mom grabbed my wrist, her grip ice cold. "You can't fight it," she said, her voice eerily calm. I yanked my arm free and ran upstairs, my heart pounding in my chest. Margaret was standing in my room, staring at the closet. The door was open again, and inside, something moved. A low, ragged breathing filled the air, and the shadows within the closet writhed unnaturally. Margaret's eyes locked onto mine. "It's not just the Watcher anymore," she whispered. Something else came through. The pendant around my neck burned hot, and I could feel it pulse in sync with the thing in the closet. Then, the whisper came again, louder than ever. "Let me in." Margaret grabbed my arm and pulled me back. "We have to end this now." I nodded, my chest tight with fear. "Tell me what to do." She pressed a small, ancient-looking knife into my hand. "The bond between you and it must be severed, but you have to face it completely. No fear, no hesitation." I swallowed hard, stepping toward the closet, my grip tightening on the blade. The shadows shifted violently, and two pale eyes blinked open within the darkness. "Come back," it hissed. I took a deep breath, raised the knife, and stepped forward. This time, I wouldn't run. I stepped closer to the closet, the knife trembling in my grip. The darkness inside pulsed, writhing like a living thing, and the pale eyes blinked, watching, waiting. My breath came in ragged gasps, but Margaret's voice grounded me from behind. "Stay strong," she said. "It will try to break you." I swallowed hard and took another step. The shadows parted slightly, revealing more of the figure lurking within. It was taller now, its limbs impossibly long, its form shifting and stretching unnaturally. Its face, if you could call it that, was a hollow void, and the closer I got, the more I felt it pulling at me, drawing me in. "Come back," it whispered, its voice twisting around me like a snake. I gritted my teeth, clutching the pendant around my neck with one hand and the knife with the other. "No," I said firmly, my voice shaking but resolute. "You can't have me." The shadows recoiled, but the Watcher didn't move. Instead, something behind it did. The smaller figure, hunched and trembling, crept forward. But this time, I saw it more clearly. It wasn't just a shadow. It looked like me, a twisted, hollow version of myself, its eyes wide with fear, its lips mouthing the same words over and over. "Let me in." Panic surged through me, but Margaret's voice rang out again. "It's feeding on your fears. It's showing you what you could become. Don't let it win." I steadied myself, gripping the knife tighter. "You're not me," I whispered. "You're just fear." The figure's eyes widened, and for the first time, it hesitated. The shadows trembled violently, as if the house itself was reacting to my defiance. The Watcher's form distorted, twitching as if in pain. Margaret acted quickly. She tossed a handful of white powder into the closet, and it burst into a blinding flare of light. The shadows shrieked, the smaller figure screaming in unison, and I felt something snap inside me, like an invisible thread being cut. The Watcher howled, its void-like face contorting in rage, but before it could lunge, I drove the knife forward. The blade pierced the air, and for a moment, it felt like I had struck something solid within the darkness. A horrific, guttural wail erupted from the closet, and the shadows collapsed inward, swirling violently before imploding into nothingness. The room was plunged into silence. I staggered back, gasping for air, and collapsed onto the floor. My heart hammered in my chest, but it was over. Margaret knelt beside me, gripping my shoulder tightly. "You did it," she said softly. "You severed the bond." I looked at the empty closet, the oppressive weight in the air finally lifting. "Is it gone?" I whispered. Margaret hesitated, staring into the dark void where the watcher had once been. "For now," she said, "but it will always try to come back. It knows you now, and it won't forget." My mom entered the room, her face pale but relieved. She knelt beside me, wrapping her arms around me in a tight embrace. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I should have believed you sooner." I leaned into her, feeling the first real sense of safety in weeks. "It's okay," I murmured. "We're safe now." Margaret sighed, standing up and looking around the room. "I'll cleanse the house again, but I think it will take time to fully heal." The next few weeks passed slowly. I slept with the lights on and the pendant still around my neck, but the nightmares had stopped. The shadows no longer seemed to creep closer, and the air felt lighter, cleaner. Margaret eventually left, but before she did, she handed me a small notebook. "Write everything down," she said. "Every dream, every shadow. If it ever comes back, you'll know what to do." I nodded, clutching the book tightly. Before she walked out the door, she turned to me one last time. "Remember, fear gives it power. If you stay strong, it has nothing to hold on to." I watched her leave, feeling both relief and an underlying dread that I couldn't quite shake. Even now, late at night, when the house is silent and the wind rustles against the windows, I still find myself glancing at the clock. 2:07 a.m. And every time, I remind myself I won't let it in.